Hi there, Tiny Owlbear here, checking in before the time-lapse begins. I'll be hanging out to the side during the time-lapse to provide hopefully helpful tips and explanations. I use the program Clip Studio Paint for drawing. It's not sponsored, but I love the programs I'll be referencing in their digital store quite a bit throughout the video. I hope this video is useful for getting tips and tricks, or simply seeing how art is made. First things first, I use an opaque watercolor brush to make head and body blobs. Then I use a pencil brush to draw line art on a vector layer. Vector layers are great for more easily correcting mistakes. This is what a vector layer looks like. I correct vector lines with this tool, the Pinch Vector Line. It comes standard with Clip Studio Paint. For coloring, I work on raster layers below the line art and fill in the shapes with a combination of the normal paint bucket tool, as well as this magical paint tool from the asset store. You can freeform draw around objects and it fills them in. I'll include a link in the description and show my settings on the next slide, just in case that's helpful. Here are my settings that I use. When you use the tool, just make sure that your lines are black, otherwise it won't fill in objects with them, at least with my settings. You can always change the line color later after you color in the shapes. For drawing the yukata patterns, I drew them from scratch and used this basis for each pattern. A design unique to the character, a symmetrical stamp shape, and then crisscrossing calligraphy loops. Klee's design was like this. The clover is originally on her cap and her dress in the game. Whereas Yanfei's design is this, which is based on the design of her skirt from the game. Yoimiya's design is so complicated. I kept changing my mind on what colors I wanted. I spent so much time on this part of her dress, and it got covered up by sparklers in the end. Hindsight is definitely 20/20, but I think the design still looks nice. Fun fact, Yoimiya's design is the only one not based on those yukata design rules I decided on before. I couldn't design on only one unique design, so I threw a bunch in, and I made so much work for myself. Sometimes you live and learn, and extra work means more time drawing, so I'm happy regardless. When drawing digitally, people often ask how many layers you're supposed to use. The answer is that it's totally up to you. I use a lot of layers when I draw, so it's all up to your own preference. The only drawback of many layers is keeping track of them, but if you organize them consistently, it's much easier to do. I organize my layers so the things in the foreground are on top and the background's on bottom. I also use a lot of folders. Since Klee and Yanfei are in the foreground, their folders are on top, in this example above. This makes organization a lot easier. I do the same with color layers. Skin's on bottom, clothes in the middle, hair on top. Getting back on track. For this part of the drawing, I was very indecisive about Hutao's design. Yoimiya had broken my design head. I finally remembered that she did have a unique design, so I changed her sleeves to match her collar. And ta-da! We have her unique design! I changed the butterfly colors for different parts of the yukata. For Amber, I decided to use her adorable constellation art as the basis for her yukata design. Her design looks like this. I also changed the colors for different parts of the yukata. Time for eyes, one of my favorite parts. I use tons of layers for eyes, so don't be afraid to use layers to add more colors and shine. One of my favorite things to do is look at eyes from artists I really like and try to figure out how they achieved certain effects. I'd highly suggest doing an eye study to just draw a lot of different types of eyes. You can even do it based on anime. Time lapses are so fast, we're already at shading. For shading, I have a few different theories on how to do it. The first method is to choose a slightly darker color and draw on the same layer by locking transparency. This is what this would look like. You click on this Lock Transparent Pixels option. Or you can create a new layer above your base, clip it to the base, and then change the upper layer to multiply or color burn, which would look like this with this button, clip to layer below. What you use is totally up to you. I personally use a mix. Sometimes I'll use transparent pixels for skin or multiply for clothing and hair. Honestly, which shade technique I use depends on my mood. Art really is pretty flexible when you get down to it. Something that I love to do with characters is add extra color to them, especially the ends of their hair. If you add a red or pink color to the hair ends, I find it makes the character look warmer, which I love for adding a cozy atmosphere. Whereas adding blues or purples to the end makes them seem cooler, which can be great for night scenes as well. Here, I added a layer of pink to the ends of Klee's hair and bangs, and then used the blur tool to blend the color in. Something I love about Clip Studio is how many blending tools the program has from the start, which is just fantastic. The main tools I use are the blur, blend, and fingertip tools that come with the base program. They look like this. Actually, I'll write in an order. Blend, blur, fingertip. I use the fingertip tool to make those streaks on Klee's hair, and all the shading on Klee's yukata have a tiny bit of blending applied. The blur tool is really great at softening hard corners and edges of shading. Just be careful not to blur all your edges. Edges are still good for shadows. If you blur a corner, still leave a lot of the shade line intact. Weirdly enough, if you blur all the edges of a shadow, it looks almost unnatural, so make sure you leave some shade lines. Speaking of shadows, we can talk more about that as I'm shading Yanfei's hair. I love shading hair. It takes me a long time to do, but I love adding a look of texture and depth to it. Shadows are fantastic for adding hair depth. For example, that shadow on Yanfei's upper hair tufts make the hair look like it has multiple layers. I like my shadows to run the length of the hair, but then show the shadow tip slightly offset so it doesn't look flat. During the shading stage, I also love to add some texture to the hair. Draw a lot of lines with the watercolor brush, and then I blend them into the hair. I've also recently been using a lovely tool from the asset store to make hash marks on the hair, and then blend it in to look like hair strands. It looks like this. I'm sorry, Amber, I keep covering you with these. I'll include a link in the description for it in case you're interested. I've noticed a good chunk of other artists really like it, or they use similar ones. Something else I often do for my hair is add highlights. My favorite way to do this is with a screen layer, which will look like this. You can use any sort of color on this layer and it will massively lighten and brighten it. I like highlighting the edges of the hair to complement the shadows, as well as in the middle areas to add a look of shine and texture. This is all just my personal style. I've seen a lot of artists do this very differently for their works. Speaking of specific art styles, something I really like to do on my art is change the line art color once I'm done coloring and shading. Since I start out using vector layers for the line art, I convert them back to raster layers and then change their color. I convert it because that way I can draw different colors on different parts of the line art instead of just all one color for the whole thing. To do this, you can right-click the vector layer and you just select rasterize. Then you lock transparency and use a dense watercolor brush to draw a different color on different parts of your line. I love to make the lines around the character dark, not completely black, make the inner lights lighter, often closer to the shade color. When I'm trying to draw shade on clothes, I'll often refer to reference pictures just to see how real clothes look or how other artists draw it. A really helpful tool I use for this while drawing is called the Sub-View tool in Clip Studio. It makes it so you can reference images more easily while you're drawing. It looks like this. It just says Sub-View at the top and then shows a picture inside. I set mine so I can toggle between it and the color wheel, so it's always to the right of my drawing. You can even use the eyedropper inside of it to grab colors and then paste those onto your drawing. This tool is super useful, not just for having references to look at, but also to grab a color you like and use it on your drawing. You can enable this feature by going to the Window tab within Clip Studio and you turn Sub-View on. I use this feature for all of my drawings, and the Sub-View can store a bunch of pictures at once, which is super useful. You can add files to it from anywhere on your computer as well. When I'm deciding on what color to use for a shade, it will also depend on what type of layer I'm working with. If I'm locking transparent pixels and using the same layer, I'll choose a color more to the right and down on the color wheel. For example, let's say I choose this color to start. For the shade, I'll pick something right and down on the wheel. The more right you go, the more vibrant the color. Whereas the more down you go, the darker the color will be. This approach is different if I shade using a multiply or a color burn layer. Let's say the base color is this vibrant red. On the multiply shade layer, I will actually pick a color left and up from the original. In other words, the approach is the opposite if I use a multiply color burn layer versus transparent pixels. I found that multiply color burn layers tend to be really dark, and I like my shadows to have some depth, but not to be so dense. Shading with transparent pixels is the most intuitive, but since it's all on one layer, it's harder to correct mistakes. The biggest thing to remember is that none of what I've said are hard rules, they're just suggestions from what I've learned. That's what makes art fantastic, is that you can do it however you like. It's better to have a lot of influences to see what works best for you, so don't just listen to me. We're finally at the background. This section's fast, so I'll try to keep up. I use a dense watercolor brush to make the sea and sand. I drew the waves with an opaque brush, which I slightly smudged the brush lines with the blend tool to make the waves look more realistic. For the sand, I used the pointillism brush that's available with Clip Studio, and then smudged the lines with the fingertip tool. For the clouds, I use a really fun brush from the asset store that's fun to work with, especially on multiple layers. This is what it looks like. I'll include a link in the description for it. It's called the Gouache Brush Set. So this is the part of the drawing where I realized I didn't like any of the sparkler brushes available, which meant I'd have to make my own. This time-lapse doesn't really do that process justice, but I played around with a lot with how to make one myself. I used a heavily tapered watercolor brush to draw white lines from the center. Then on the lower layer, I added color to accent that. The brush I used for those taper lines is, believe it or not, a hair strand brush that I don't normally use for hair. I just really like the shape of it, so whenever I want a tapered brush that isn't for calligraphy, I use this. If you're interested, I'll also include a link below. I also added sparkles on an upper layer, as a lot of the sparklers have these sorts of shiny bits to them. This brush is available right from Clip Studio in the decorations section. Now it's time to set the scene. I first add all the characters to one big folder, then I clip a multiply layer to the folder. At first I couldn't decide if I wanted to make their faces glow, so I overcorrected with a bright white and their faces got washed out. Finally, I went back to the multiply layer and used orange on the parts of the character furthest from the light. I used yellow on the areas closest to the sparklers, which makes those areas brighter despite being on a multiply layer. Finally, I clipped a glow layer to the folder and drew glowing sections on everyone's hair, yukata, and arms. I used the blur tool to blur the edges of the glowing sections to make them look more natural as well. Finally, I like to do some adjustments by right-clicking the folders and characters to add a correction layer, which looks like this. I often just correct brightness and contrast. Finally, I add my signature, lock transparency on it, color it to blend in with the sand, and I'm done! Here's the final illustration. Thank you for watching until the very end. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was helpful for seeing how art can be made. If you enjoyed this or know someone who might enjoy this, please feel free to pass it along. If you enjoyed this and would like to see more, let me know in the comments. I'm also active on Twitter and Pixiv, where you can see my other illustrations. Thank you so much for watching.